I'm going to ask Gail Goldberg, who is moderating our last panel of the day, to come up here. I'm going to let Gail introduce her panel, but in the meanwhile, I will introduce Gail. Gail, as I'm sure many of you know, is the head of ULI Los Angeles. Before that, she was the chief planner for the city of Los Angeles, and before that, she was chief planner for the city of San Diego. So how many of you have noticed how downtown San Diego is like 10 times better now than it was 20 years ago? This is the woman who is responsible for that. Thank you. So really wonderful to have her moderate what I'm sure will be a terrific panel. And I'll turn it over to Gail to introduce them.
Well, thank you all very much, and thank you for inviting us. We're all thrilled to be here. It's an interesting discussion. Our particular panel today is called, and I'm sure Richard Green wrote the title, "Why Can't We Get It Right?" Assuming, I guess, that getting it right is increasing the production of housing in Los Angeles to begin to meet the demand. Well, hey, Richard, it's really hard to get it right. Clearly, we are not producing enough housing in our state and in our region to meet the demands, especially if we think about housing for everyone, including affordable and accessible housing. So we're going to talk today about what gets in the way: regulations, politics, resistance, and sometimes just a systemic dysfunction that is hard to challenge, and so understanding why we aren't getting it right is a difficult thing, but we need to talk about the why so that we can begin to set a stage for change. We have a great panel today, and hopefully we can shed some light on some of these issues and help us clarify a strategy to move forward. I'm going to take my cue from the former panel, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists to tell us who you are with, and what you do there. So, Tony.
I am Tony Salazar. I'm a principal with the firm McCormack Salazar. We're a national real estate development company that focuses on rebuilding in the urban core in and around downtowns. Have been there for over about 44 years. And I've been a developer for the past 38 years in major high-cost areas throughout the country.
Meea.
I'm Meea Kang, and I'm with Related California, Senior Vice President. Before joining Related, I was also president of Domus Development, a company I started about 15 years ago. Been building affordable housing for the last 20 years. But affordable housing is very challenging, so I wear a lot of hats. I'm also a director on the Council of Infill Builders, working on state policy. I'm a commissioner on the California Commission on Aging, and I also serve as a board member for the California Housing Consortium. So I work a lot in state politics as well to try to move legislation to make it better and easier to get housing built.
And Richard.
I'm a reformed planning director. Spent 40 years in the public sector with the communities of Los Angeles, working for the Community Redevelopment Agency in the 90s, working for the city of Anaheim for 10 years. The city of Pasadena for 10 years, and most recently retired from the position of Director of Planning for the County of Los Angeles.
And you really have not had time to reform. Mark.
Hi, yeah, so I'm Mark Vallianatos, and I'm Director of LA Plus, which is a think tank focused on urban change in the LA region. I'm also the co-founder and policy director of Abundant Housing LA, which is a YIMBY pro-housing organization here in Southern California. And happy to be tackling this issue.
Well, thanks. Tony, I think we'll start with you so that we can get maybe a little perspective from a national view of development. Are the challenges that we're having here, are those challenges the same across the country? Are there cities that are getting it right?
I don't think anybody's getting it right at this point. And yes, the issues are the same, particularly in the high-cost areas where I work, like New York, San Francisco, Washington, D.C. These issues are the same, and largely it's because we have been building over these last several years the same type of product, an overabundance of high-end market rate rental. It's good for cities. It's good for development. The filtering process is important, but that filtering process is very slow. And these high-end market rate rentals have been occurring in submarkets, specific submarkets in every major city, and that's and it's been great for those submarkets. The issue that every city has right now is that the demand for those units and the demand to be in those particular submarkets in this country have now spilled over into adjacent neighborhoods. And what is happening is that the workforce that lives in these adjacent neighborhoods, people like investors and pioneers and speculators have gone in and really taken naturally occurring affordable housing and converting them to high-end rental, and consequently you have displacement of our workforce that are now being driven, that are being moved out of their own neighborhoods and have to drive until they find affordability, causing a lot of disruption with our jobs. So it's one of those issues where we've got housing being built. It's good for the city, but you know, everyone's recognizing the need to build housing for the workforce to have better relations with their commuting and have a better and have a less impact on the environment.
So Tony, for those developers who are going into existing neighborhoods and buying these older small apartment units and upgrading them, is this something new? Because I think we have all thought that the whole idea was whatever production we would create would work in the market because of the sort of trickle-down theory of people.
That's right.
So have we eliminated that opportunity for trickle-down?
No, I think the issue that is cities in high-cost areas like LA and areas like Boyle Heights and Lincoln Heights and Westlake, MacArthur Park area, is that going down, filtering down, and taking these properties is one that makes a lot of sense, and it's naturally occurring as part of the filter process. The issue is there's no place for them to go.
Got it.
Right? Because the reason huge backlash is we all follow Boyle Heights is that there's just no place for them to go. I mean, people in Boyle Heights live in garages. Mm-hmm. I mean, you know, they came filtered and dispersed down into their own neighborhoods. So we've got a movement going on, and that causes enormous political issues that you're seeing occurring now, and their pressure on the politicians, and then that whole whiplash back to developers of, you know, limiting what we can build, where we can build it, and limiting the whole process of production.
Well, we're going to talk in a little while about that sort of resistance from communities, but why don't we go to Meea? And Meea, you have been involved in some statewide commissions, and I think you're probably pretty up to speed on what the state is trying to do now to increase production. Why don't you give us a brief overview of maybe a few of the new housing pieces of legislation? I think Chris Thornburg has already told us that they're not going to work, but why don't you tell us about them anyway?
Well, as a developer, I think I tend to be probably like Tony. We're optimists, right? Because, you know, everyone's going to tell you no, and everyone's going to tell you why it's not going to work, and you're just going to bust through and figure out a way to make things work. I think we saw a historic year this year with a number of hard votes that happened this year in the legislature that required a 2/3 vote. So that means you needed some bipartisanship that happened. I would say housing was the last sort of big agenda item that needed to get solved in this year's legislative cycle. Key bills are about 15 that were part of the official housing package. However, there were several other bills that were also part of sort of a whole sort of fix. So the governor really wanted to see a series of things. One being funding. We needed new funding. We all know that. Affordable housing, market rate housing, infrastructure, infill. We know that part of the Prop 13 problem is there isn't enough money to build the dense product where we want it to be, near transit, for example. So funding was a part of it. Regulatory relief, so some kind of streamlining, aka CEQA streamlining, was also part of the solution, and there are a number of bills that address that. And then also really enforcement, housing accountability and enforcement, strengthening housing element law. So a couple of the key bills, SB 2, which is the one that was really hard fought, which is Senator Atkins out of San Diego, multiple times trying to get a $75 document recording fee passed. At the 11th hour, it was completely gutted and reworked. And so now SB 2, which will generate, starting next year, from about estimated $250 to $300 million annually, will now go to local governments for planning. So half of the money in the first year is going to go to HCD to program for homelessness, and then half of the money is going to go to local governments on sort of a CDBG block grant style. And it's going to go, so local governments across the state are going to have now dollars that they can plan, whether it's updating their general plans, their specific plans, or even their homeless plans, or actually using the dollars to incentivize affordable housing production in their communities. So that's really big, and that's going to change a lot of things going forward. And by the way, starting in 2019, that's going to shift to 70% of the money is going to go to locals, 30% is going to go to the state HCD. Next year, we will see on the ballot Senator Bell's bill, which is SB 3. It's a $4 billion bond. It's going to be on the 18 ballot. And that will bring funding, badly needed funding, back to the state. It's going to go into typical programs like we've seen before under Prop 46 and 1C. So it's the TOD program, the infrastructure infill grant program, the multi-housing family program. So affordable housing funding for the first time, if that passes, will go back into the coffers of the state. But that's a one-time bond, so it needs sort of perpetual funding. And then as far as accountability, there was a Skinner bill called SB 167, maybe write it down, because for the first time ever now, local governments cannot easily deny projects. That includes some affordable housing, but also mixed income housing. So if there's a mixed income project, a JJJ project or something like that in LA, cities can no longer just deny them because of NIMBYism. So there's more teeth in the law as far as housing accountability. So we're seeing that in a bill that I worked on, that was my brainchild. I worked with Assembly Member Richard Bloom. It's called NIFTY, AB 1568, and that actually allows for enhanced infrastructure finance districts to act like redevelopment agencies and create 20% set aside for affordable housing by utilizing local share of property tax and sales tax and use tax increment within cities now. And so, for example, the LA River could be helped with that by adding new sales tax and use tax as part of the mix for financing. So we're seeing innovation, we're seeing people try to think outside the box given the political hurdles that you have to solve for. So none of these are silver bullets. All these things kind of go around the edges, but at the same time, it is progress. We are seeing change, and this governor has finally done something on housing.
So, Richard, I'm going to ask you, before you reform too quickly, to put your county planning director hat back on for a moment. And I know the county is probably excited about any kind of new money that comes in, but how excited are they about the state telling them that they can't disapprove a project? Will this work?
Well, first of all, I think new money, particularly in planning, is very important to move towards getting it right, because fundamentally there's a planning dialogue that has to take place that hasn't taken place in a long time. Speaking about the county or more generally, local government does not like Sacramento fooling with their local land use powers and control. And so the first reaction is probably to stiffen the back and look at it and resist. And don't underestimate the cleverness of local government to resist that and retain its autonomy in local land use planning issues. And certainly there'll be lawsuits, and this will take quite a while to sort out. But I think there is a shift, particularly at LA County with this board's leadership. They are committed to housing and working hard to solve the housing crisis, as evidenced by their leadership in the homeless tax recently. But generally, local government does not like Sacramento telling them what to do, and the history is not a good one. The density bonus laws, quite frankly, were very poorly written and in some ways were dysfunctional. So there will be a certain amount of resistance in that, and I certainly the money is a solution, but I'm not sure the regulation from Sacramento is welcomed.
And Mark, you have been doing a lot of work with organizations and with the development community to sort of look at what the regulatory constraints are and to come up with some solutions. So how do your groups view the state interjection into our local politics?
I think that most pro-housing advocates do see a role for state preemption and intervention. I'll cite the example of ADUs, backyard homes, second units. It's something that cities have bizarrely thwarted for decades. The state has tried to force them to accept them. The package of bills, package of two bills in 2016 has finally unlocked some ADUs. You have, like in the city of LA, they went from 40 a year to on pace to get over 1,000. Santa Barbara went from like one every 2 years to a couple hundred. So I feel like there's the bad planning or the recalcitrance on the part of residents to accept more homes has caused an economic crisis in some ways in the state. It's prevented people from moving to California to pursue their dreams. And when that happens, you need to step in and basically force, allow homes to be built so we can have a diverse society.
Tony, you have been all over. What do you think are the biggest constraints here locally that are unique to our local environment or to the state of California?
Just talking about Los Angeles, and I'll bring in San Francisco. The density or lack of any interest in it, time to get development built, CEQA is painful, and the layering of an enormous amount of regulatory issues and payments, impact payments for delivering housing. And I'll give you an example of that last one. It cost me about $450,000 a unit here in LA. Same unit, $850,000 in San Francisco. All largely due to regulatory issues and things that get layered on. So these are the kinds of things that kind of impede production, and production is paramount here. I mean, and density goes with that. So if we go away with anything today, we need to increase production. And then secondly is that another issue is the people and the companies that can do production are not in that ball game of developing the affordable housing side, as Meea was going through. They're just not there because we have an unregulated, and some of you are developers or some of you work for private developers, work in this unregulated world, and the affordable housing stuff is all regulated, and developers are either doing one or the other, right? And we need people that have production capacity to build both. And to give, as a quick example is this, all the initiative that this city has gone through in the last several years about developing for a homeless, right? Who's developing it? Where are you doing it? Because who's producing it? It's been left to the hands of smaller nonprofits because that's what they do. But it's a production issue, and our producers are not there. Which brings me to my last point. In LA, there's a competition for land. Okay, we're all competing for the same land. Doesn't matter if you're a for-profit, nonprofit, church, government, fire stations. There's land out there. And it's anybody's for the taking. Whoever can get their politics right with the community and with government. And there isn't at the planning level to say, here's the land, here's what goes there. I mean, it's kind of here's what can go there, but there needs to be a step of connecting policy with actual what goes at the site and the necessary funding if one needs to incentivize people who produce a product.
So how much does the planning help, Richard?
Well, we're fighting this on a one-off basis. Every
That's right.
time a project comes forward, the developer or the property owner has to face the neighborhood alone or with planning, and it ends up in a public hearing. We're not facing it from a broad policy perspective. And I really appreciate what Tony has said. If we were part of getting it right is to have an honest dialogue with the neighborhoods and say, this is what's going here. It's by right, expect it to happen. Don't flip out when it does happen. Understand the future. What's happening today is we're sort of hooked on this drug of discretionary actions and conditional use permits, which puts the projects all at risk and leads to a negotiation between property owner, planning department, neighborhood, where it's an escalation of extractions and costs and time. And if we had the upfront discussion, it would be by right, conform to the rules, move forward.
Go ahead.
I just need to add another one that's peculiar to Los Angeles as a high-cost area. We do not have a strong mayor form of government here. As those of you know who worked through this process, you've got, as Richard was saying, if you're developing, you are on your own. You know, go buy the land, go work your politics, go do everything alone. That is much different experience that I have when I'm in San Francisco or New York, where you start at the mayor's office, and the mayor says, that's a good project. Let's get our planning department, let's get our finance people, let's get our housing people, everybody behind it, and let's go get this done, and the time gets compressed. But when you have so many mayors here, and the community politics on top of that gets layered, it extends this development process out several more years.
I can't help but throw out there, as the former planning director of San Diego, where they have a long history of good planning, the first place a developer in San Diego goes to is the planning department.
There you go.
Yeah. So why don't we have planning in Los Angeles? And I recognize that there are some small cities that do, but this is sort of an entrepreneurial city where, you know, we're sort of project by project planning. Why have we resisted planning for the last 20 years? Why don't we want planning?
Well, part of the reason is that there's still an old politics of land use in the region where the organizations, individuals who wanted a slow growth, they essentially won the battle between 1970 and 2000. And so they have every incentive in the world to want to keep the old plans in place because they dramatically downzoned the city and many of the cities in the county. They also created, you know, difficult procedures to go through, as we've discussed. And then even people who want to build things or who might want to build things, they see themselves, like, you know, as Tony's mentioning, the council persons they get a lot of their juice from being able to come and make a deal between opponents and developers. And so they have an incentive to keep that power. You have a lot of interest groups who might want housing to be built, but they want to get certain conditions on it, whether it's on labor or on affordability. So they see they win from a system that's inefficient. And the developers, the development community, you know, you or the lending community, you want to get individual projects done because that's, you know, your business model, but you don't necessarily have a unified voice together that can change the overall system. And so there's really been no organized constituency that wants good rules and a simple process, which is probably what we need. Maybe the new kind of YIMBY pro-housing activists will get there. Maybe hopefully a coalition of people who see the harm from the housing crisis will help us get there. But it's kind of this inertia of, we made slow growth plans, some people win from bad systems, and those two have been a really hard obstacles to get through.
So one of the problems we're having here without the plans is that we have a lot of things that are in a discretionary process, because developers come in and say, this old plan does not reflect the current market. It doesn't even reflect what the cities and the region needs. So they propose something different that throws them into this long process that we have here in Los Angeles. I don't know that we can solve the problem until we try to figure out who wants to solve the problem. So let's talk about that for just a second. Who wants to produce more housing in Los Angeles, in our region, more quickly? Who?
Well, let me talk to that, and also to how to get it, a little bit of how to get it right. One of the largest accomplishments of the Los Angeles County Planning Department during my tenure was updating the county's general plan. Just for context, the county's about 2,000 square miles and about 1 million people live in an unincorporated county. The county general plan had not been updated since 1980. So when you talk about old plans, this is decades behind the time. Finally, that happened, and I think through some leadership, political leadership, there was a desire to upgrade the plans, particularly in in our parlance in the 5th District, in the north part of the county. And not only did that happen, but there was a leadership there, so leadership is important, and the property owners and community in, say, the Newhall Ranch area said yes, and quickly following the update of the plan, almost 20,000 units were approved.
Is it easier in the county because you're not proposing dense urban growth in communities where people already live?
Yes and no. One is that in the county there are 5 supervisors. Each one obviously has a territory, and so there's one voice. There's sort of a mayor of each district, if you will, and you've got one, not 15 plus a mayor to deal with. And 2, most of the land is suburban. There are pockets, and there are about half a dozen rail stations in urbanized areas that are in the county, and those were upgraded through the county general plan. The neighborhoods are not as organized, and quite frankly, some of those neighborhoods are not as wealthy and haven't seen the growth, so they haven't come to the mature point of the backlash that Tony talked about. So I think part of the concern is the backlash to some growth, and quite frankly, in the 70s and 80s, some poor construction, some not great architecture that has led to this backlash and absolute fear, which leads to a discretionary action. So if you're not comfortable with the discussion and you're not comfortable with the policy, then make everything discretionary so I can look at it one-off.
So Meea, do you have any ideas to help us with this? Who wants more housing in Los Angeles?
Well, I look at it kind of, the population's growing. You know, we're going to hit 50 million. You know, LA is growing. You know, we're not building enough housing in Los Angeles to keep up with the population, and more people just keep coming. So we've seen more homelessness on the streets. Since I sit on the Commission on Aging, there are about 250,000 seniors in Los Angeles, city of LA, that are on the verge of homelessness. You know, people are living longer. And, you know, you've got Prop 13 protection, so people are staying in their homes. And so we're seeing, you know, things aren't turning over as quickly, so this sort of filtration of housing doesn't exist until you build it. So quite honestly, I think everyone actually wants housing. I think people want housing for their parents, people want housing for their kids, and people want to find affordable housing. So quite honestly, I think people actually want housing. But I think when you give people choice in their neighborhoods to decide whether or not a big development is going to come to their neighborhood, they're going to react negatively because they don't have the faculty to actually understand how that bigger picture works, right? But they could say no, because status quo today is safer than what you don't know tomorrow. And so the reality is, you know, I've never met a plan I haven't had to change in my development career. Every single plan is flawed. And they're built so tightly that there's no flexibility in these plans. So they're built for the community, yet they're not built for the developers. The developers want to be building the housing, because why? Because it's what we do. It's how we make money. It's what we do. But at the same time, it's this inertia, quite honestly, I think you got to cut through the red tape. So my feeling is local, you get a plan that works with some flexibility, call it form-based, whatever, you don't talk about density. It doesn't matter. If it's 5 stories, who cares how many units is in 5 stories? If 5 stories is what works in your neighborhood. Then you have these communities that say, I need services. I want a Starbucks. I want to have grocery stores. Well, you need rooftops for that. Businesses won't come in without the housing. People don't connect those dots. You have businesses that leave California because they don't have workers because there's no housing. So you see this whole cycle, but unfortunately, Mrs. Smith, who lives on the street for 50 years, doesn't really care about that. And so I think when the way that our sort of democracy works with local control, and I can tell you, I've had many, many arguments with a lot of local control, advocates, politicians, League of Cities. And the parking bill I did, AB 744, which is a density bonus amendment, I worked with Donald Shoup on it, cut through all local zoning. Parking is a big reason why housing's so expensive, and we're actually not driving as much societally than we have. So this bill actually reduces the minimum parking requirement for mixed income housing down to 0.5 per unit and 0.3 for special needs housing. Anyway, but the reality is local governments hated it because it took local control away, but they all pulled me inside and said, we need this because it's political cover. It's CYA. So I can tell you the first time I used it in a city in San Diego, the planning director stood up and said, we're going to give her a parking reduction because here's this bill, and he read it. And every single planning commissioner argued that they could not live in a housing unit that only had 1 parking space because they already had 3 cars in their household. So everyone puts this personal lens on these things. And then at the same time, they all just kind of relented to the fact that, they all said, well, the governor made us do this. We have to do it. Unanimous vote approved, right? You need that political cover to do the right thing. I can't tell you how many NIMBYs have told me, they were against the projects. I built affordable housing. They were against the affordable housing. And then after it's all built, I had my NIMBYs come up and tell me, wow, I didn't realize it was going to be this nice. Had you told me it was going to be this nice, I wouldn't have opposed you, right? Mm-hmm. So they don't always get it. They don't get the bigger picture. So frankly, we've got to create guardrails to make sure that what needs to happen from a state policy perspective, what needs to happen from a livability perspective, all of this is sustainable, right? We need housing, we need tax dollars to stay local so our businesses can stay open. So Amazon doesn't come in and take over the world, right? We need to have local businesses. You need to have rooftops. You need people walking. You need health. You need transit.
But those are the discussions that can really only happen in a planning process, not when you're reviewing a project. And I mean, one of my observations in Los Angeles is that because we have not had the vision discussion as part of a general plan update or community plan updates, we have the vision discussion with every project that comes forward, because people don't know where it's going. And if people don't know where it's going, then they are more likely to resist. So I'm going to go ahead.
That was one of the things I was going to mention. It's, again, you have to match policy and the vision and what goes there with specific sites or specific submarkets. Because if you don't do that, then it is catch as catch can. Developers are going to come to you. But going back to your question about who wants it, who wants production? I mean, who wants more? And it's when you look just back these last several years, the elected officials who represented both Hollywood and downtown said, we want production, we want density. We're willing to support it. We're willing to go out on the limb, and we're going to have predictability. We're going to have identifying, what goes on in those sites. We're giving it political will, and we're giving incentives, and the financing from Wall Street is there. When you have those elements all working together and lined up, you're going to have production, right? And that's what drives the. I'm a developer. I'll build anything. If Wall Street says we're giving you money to build dog houses, I want to go build 10 million of them. And that's what developers do. I mean, it's financing to do production is as important as all these other elements because and some developers I know who were 15 years ago were building single-family homes are now building multifamily, right? Because that's what people do today. Next time it's going to be industrial, you know. Next time it's mixed use. I mean, we haven't gotten it right where it says we're going to go into cities and have a multi-prong approach and build where all these elements or different kinds of developments are connected, and they're all working to positively impact those submarkets. But we generally take whatever the market's going and the financing is behind it.
Just wanted to add that we should give credit to the voters of Los Angeles. You know, 70% of the voters rejected Measure S early this year. That's a total reversal from 1987 when 70% supported Prop U, which downzoned the boulevards. So we kind of have at least an anti-housing majority in the city. You know, the same percentage voted for Measure HHH to tax themselves, to build more permanent supportive housing. You know, for the transit measure to expand Metro. So we have a public that is way more willing than in the past to say, yes, we do want some urban change, we do need more housing. The question is that our systems haven't yet caught up, and so those are what we need to reform. The rules, you know, update the general plan, update the community plans, change the processes. Then hopefully that kind of silent majority of voters who actually do want to allow housing, that the politics and policy can go together.
Yeah, is everybody convinced that Measure S was a positive response from the community, that they want housing? Am I the only one who thinks maybe there was a lot of other things? And I'm not convinced that it means at all that the communities want housing.
Well, first of all, zoning and dealing with development through these propositions is not the thoughtful, quite frank, dialogue we need to have. And I think we do need to step back. Those are knee-jerk reactions to other things going on in the world. So I think that it does come back to an honest dialogue about where are we going as a community, where are our kids going to live, where are our parents going to live, and having that on a very broad discussion, and then understanding how it comes to local decision making. But I can't tell you, as you said earlier, I can't tell you the backlash I got in, and I'll name the city, in Pasadena, because I'm no longer a planning director there, about dwelling units, accessory dwelling units. The fear was so deep that they thought it was going to cause traffic problems. You're going to get if you got 100 new units spread out over the 23 miles of Pasadena, it is not going to cause traffic problems. But the fear of change, because they didn't understand it and they didn't have the bigger dialogue, was so deep-grained. And then it results in the CEQA battles, because then it's a discretionary action. And the CEQA battles, the battle over the environmental impact reports and neg decs is amazing. What used to be a very simple checklist over whether a project had impacts or didn't, then turned into volumes in something that looks like the old-fashioned encyclopedias. But a negative deck, which used to be a fairly simple document, now is several volumes, and it's just gotten completely out of control.
If Measure S was a warning, if you will, a shot to the bow from communities who have said, we've had enough, we don't want, I mean, they were willing to just shut down development. And by the skin of our teeth, we got through that. As a result of that, what the heck is anybody doing to make sure there's not another Measure S on the ballot? What are we doing to begin to counter this resistance that we have consistently in communities around development? And I guess it gets to my question of who wants a lot more housing in LA? Besides the people in this room and the real estate community, the neighborhoods don't want it. The politicians who follow the neighborhoods don't want it. How do we begin? I mean, to get it right, we have to build a coalition that wants it. And I think we have to start with who are our easy targets? How can we change the hearts and minds of people around housing. So help me here. How can we change the hearts and minds of communities?
I think some basic facts, and I think Meea started with this, that it's not about them, it's about us and our family. I think about children, parents, grandparents, and we haven't had that discussion. Where are they going to live? And I think it takes that honest discussion, and then to say, you know what, it's got to be local. Mm-hmm. And I think also the planners have, since the demise of redevelopment, and I admit, a big fan of redevelopment, there grew a generation of planners who talked to neighbors in neighborhoods in a very direct way and had the resources to have those long discussions. When we adopted the prior plan for Hollywood, the community plan in Hollywood, we had over 200 community meetings. And yes, they were painful, and yes, there were angry audiences, but we hashed it out. We ended up with compromise, and the community knew what to expect at that time. But it does take a persistent community dialogue of talented communicators, and I think we've lost that. I think we really need to build that expertise. There is more funding going to the city's planning department, and they are hiring at a pretty rapid rate. There's got to be a lot of training with those folks in communications, because what we really do need communication skills there in that dialogue, and the staying power to come to compromises with communities.
Tony.
I agree with Richard. And to take it a step further, I think that needs to be taken to specific submarkets, mm-hmm. right? And it can't be a citywide discussion. I mean, mm-hmm. I agree with you, Gail. I mean, it's not a citywide discussion because people in communities are just not going to go there with you. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the submarkets like Hollywood, mm-hmm. downtown, around transit stops, around major corridors, where you have the ability to do density and ability to take and bring in mixed use and bring in other higher dense uses that are both rental and for sale, could be mixed income, could be all kinds of things. That's where you start the discussion. I mean, that's where you start building your coalitions, mm-hmm. not on a citywide basis.
Right.
And I think once you do that, and once you start redeveloping in those areas, and it's no different than the redevelopment agencies, because that's what they did. Mm-hmm. They had specific geographical areas that they deployed people. They brought in, they worked with the communities. They said, on this specific piece of land, here is the type of development that we should be building, mm-hmm. and then bringing in government approvals and incentives. So I think that's the right approach that LA should be going forth in specific, tight submarkets and building a coalition around.
In terms of the political question of what is your potential pro-housing coalition, at LA Plus we've been trying to work on this for the past 6 months with some of you in this room, and the idea is kind of like, how do you bring together the groups that did oppose Measure S, that did represent 70% of votes, but that are kind of different sectors or different types of interest groups. So we've been working in a process that has both business organizations like the Chamber of Commerce and also SCANF representing nonprofit housing developers, experts on land use like ULI, AIA, APA, LA, and then also some of the academic institutions, including the Lusk Center, and also groups at Pepperdine and UCLA, to think about like what is a set of pro-housing messages and policies that would help in Los Angeles, because I do think that's been missing. Essentially, you've had the affordable advocates, community advocates, been successful getting some, going to the market to try to get the money for affordable housing because society hasn't ponied up enough. You've had, market rate developers either playing defense or going for their own projects, but you haven't brought them together in a coalition that's like, we need more of all types of homes to keep LA a diverse, thriving city. And what is the kind of, what is the package of rule changes that can make that happen? And hopefully we'll see that move forward. But I do feel like it's been a void, it's been a vacuum, and it takes a while to bring that together.
Just two groups that are probably, well, the one group is probably the most powerful in LA today in the politics is labor. And I think labor is behind that, and labor has come to the forefront and gotten much more organized about supporting projects. And when any large project goes forward, you'll see labor at the table. And they're very influential with both city politics and county politics today. The other group, which is much more enlightened, I think, over the last decade, is the environmental groups, which used to resist, but realize that we've got to grow smart. And I think it is a very positive change, as opposed to no, no, no. I think the sophisticated environmental groups are saying, yes, let's build smart. Let's build in the urbanized areas, preserve the outlying areas and the sensitive environmental lands that we have in the county, and pick and choose our spots. And I think that dialogue is very much worth having.
And I think that really gets back to the transit-oriented development that I think LA is really embracing. And I think that's where you're going to see the greatest opportunity and the greatest change. I mean, you look at high-speed rail coming into Union Station. I think all of that area is going to be completely changed. I think you look at the opportunity from the state level in terms of funding for that. So it's funding the infrastructure, it's providing the financing, and you're going to be able to start seeing density in these areas. But there's going to need to be leadership. There's going to be political leadership to say, in these areas, we can permit this type of housing and these types of uses. You're going to see the greatest change in LA in those areas.
I'll share with you that in my first year as planning director of Los Angeles, we were charged with doing station area plans for, I think, 10 stations of the Expo line as it was building. And without exception, every one of the 10 communities that I went to, at the first meeting, 75 people showed up, and the first thing they said was, we don't want the station. I said, I think you came to the wrong meeting. I mean, they're building the station. I mean, let me give you Metro's number. And then we started talking, and they said, we don't want all that development. And I said, that's sort of a non-starter too, because our policy in the city is to support this investment with density and with land uses that will increase ridership, you know, and I went through this whole thing, and they were not persuaded because I was making a growth argument. And, you know, Richard, you talked about convincing people by telling them, you know, you're building for their children. I'm telling you, these people didn't care. They said my children can move, you know. If they can't afford to live here, they can move. It felt to me quickly like we were making our problem, you know, the public sector's problem is accommodating growth. It's not the communities. And we were sort of making our problem their problem, and they weren't interested. But when we were able to change the dialogue to talking about how can we use this investment that is being made in your community to make your neighborhood better for you? How can we make it better for you? That was when they were willing to have a discussion. So I'm going to pose to you, as we are out there trying to convince the community that housing is a good thing and that growth is a good thing, I mean, they may not know that, but stagnation is not a good thing. How can we begin to have the dialogue that we can accommodate growth in a way that can increase investment in amenities and infrastructure and things they haven't seen? How do we begin to do that if we're going to convince people that housing is a good thing? So let's talk about amenities and infrastructure that benefit the community, not the project itself. How important do you guys think that is?
It's critical. I mean, it goes back to what Richard was saying about having the dialogue with the community. It isn't just on the planning side, but the developer has to have that conversation and has to be the broker between the community and the elected officials, where you get the approval to say, you know, here's how much market rate I can build with affordable and a mixed use component, because they want to have some retail or a daycare center or a health facility or something else that needs to get built with it in order to get your approvals. So it is, they do have influence and a stake in all of this, and can really hold you up if you don't accommodate them in many ways. And then, you know, you just have those groups of people, like you were saying, they just don't want you there. And I'll give you two examples, both along the gold line. So I was developing at the Avenue 57, an affordable housing development there. People came out and said, we don't want them. Don't build it. You know, we don't want any low-income people here. Well, it's a straight tax credit deal. So they're working people. I mean, it's just a working group. And then you come down the goal line to First and Boyle Heights, and the same development, same income group, they didn't want it because the rents were too high. You know? So you have to, you know, push the rents up on one side, add more amenities to them, because we added some retail and other kinds of services. And at the other, had to take the retail out to accommodate the lower income rents. So it's all within a few miles of each other. So it's part of the negotiations of getting something done in this town that you have to take the lead on.
Let me contrast that with a more positive story, maybe.
Yeah.
And that is further out on the goal line.
Mm-hmm.
And when folks, I'll say Monrovia, Duarte, and moving further out, even Laverne, where they haven't, the goal line hasn't reached, but will in 2025. They look back at cities like Pasadena and others, and what Monrovia is doing, and they said, we want that, we want those. But it took bus tours, it took education, and there is a sort of, you know, it was the earlier panel talked about the return to downtown, but some of them inner suburbs, some of them just suburbs, are still looking for a downtown and looking for coffee and looking for a real place that they can walk to. And those communities, on a certain scale, 2, 3, 4 stories, not high rise, have embraced this. They've seen it, they've seen what benefits they bring to their community, and they've realized they can walk and get a cup of coffee and walk and do their daily chores. And I think some of the good developments that have happened early on have really shed a light on and educated those communities. But it takes a lot of work and a lot of education. But those communities, as you move further out the goal line, are embracing the idea of moderate density near the goal line.
They see the benefit of change.
They see the benefit of change and amenity.
Better.
Today I took the gold line here.
Yeah.
I took the gold line to the red line, and it was quicker than I could have driven, and relatively pleasant.
Well, I think there are great examples, as we've been hearing, you know, redevelopment. I mean, you look at downtown, you look at all these areas that redevelopment has been very successful in bringing community benefits. Parks, you know, infrastructure. And that goes hand in hand with development, but it isn't just a one-off opportunity. Right. It really has to be, you know, a district or a region. And it takes the politicians to actually sell that. It takes your planning agencies to sell that vision to the community. But once they can buy into sort of what might be possible, if they let go of all their daggers, then you actually can start to see the market doing what the plan wants it. As long as that plan is flexible enough and has the right incentives and the financing to back it up. Because the market is not going to just build it. They will not build all those community benefits. The market will just not build affordable housing. The market will just not build, you know, the new sewer infrastructure that needs to be put in place.
Well, you've touched on one of our biggest challenges, which is how do we make Los Angeles as a region aspirational? How do we make them believe that change can make our lives better when some of them believe that their only experience with change in LA has been negative? So how do we make them more aspirational? And is your organization that is bringing people together, are you thinking about things like that? How to create a better message?
Yeah, I mean, that's the impetus for the name, essentially. And I don't think anyone knows the exact way to do it, but there obviously are great examples in the region. There's actually great examples from history, from the types of kind of low to mid density multifamily housing that people love in Los Angeles. The bungalow courts, some courtyard apartments, the duplexes and stuff like that. they used to be legal to build them, and people don't realize that we then methodically outlawed them with parking rules and setbacks and density restrictions and stuff. But when you go build a building today in Silver Lake or something, they'll be like, don't build a small lot subdivision, build a bungalow court. They need to understand that we outlawed them, right? But we can go back to allowing more flexible types of good living for all types of people. And then there are great examples from other regions in the world. And we heard some in the earlier panel and some today, like what are the visuals we can bring to show what Los Angeles could be based on cool stuff other places. And then I always go back to the politics that we create systems that allow the tiny fraction, the most angry people to essentially determine what happens versus getting everyone together and say, what are the big picture goals for the region, whether it's reduced, greenhouse gas emissions, or it's more affordable housing, or more parks, whatever. Set those rules, and then let people go, let nonprofits and for-profits and co-ops and whatever just go out and build stuff to make, to fill in those goals. So I think it all does go back to we plan at the wrong level, at the project level, rather than regionally or citywide. And if we can fix those with the good examples, then we'll get there.
So before I open it up to audience questions, I want to go down the line and ask each one of you in just a few sentences to tell me, what is the one thing that we should tackle that will get us closer to getting it right? What's the one thing?
If I had to take a rifle shot, as you're saying, it would be density around specific corridors. And starting there, building the coalition, starting there and moving out. Because I agree that housing, like transportation, is a regional problem. And it's a regional solution. And the submarkets like downtown and Hollywood are great. That's where all density is. But it's got to be spread to
So you would focus on the transit and the transit corridors.
And starting with density and starting the coalitions there and spreading across the region and going with different types of density after.
Meea.
I'm a believer that LA actually is visionary, and I think we've already seen great examples. I mean, you pass, Measure M for Metro. I mean, no one believed that LA could have a subway, and you have a subway, and you have functioning transit. I lived in LA 20 years ago, no functioning transit. So it's already changing, so I see it as a huge opportunity, and I think automated vehicles. I mean, we haven't talked about that, but that's going to change land use completely. And you're going to start to see that. I know the city of LA has a guy in the office now, in the mayor's office, looking at AV and how that's going to change and how we're going to shape that. So I think LA is ripe for change, and it's going to happen in these corridors first. But those corridors already bisect all these different neighborhoods that have been resistant with change. But if you could start to really focus on whether it's a half mile around the transit station or whatnot, and really just say that's your zone, that's where you're going to have all your density, that's where all this stuff is going to be permitted. And then from that, you'll start to see, in my opinion, the fruits of that labor, because you will see the development, people will realize it, and they'll say, God, it's really not that bad. It's actually really great, because now there's housing opportunities, there's parks, and there's stores and transit.
Richard.
I think increasing the communication skills on both sides of the dialogue, and teaching people that density is not necessarily high-rise. Paris is a very, very dense city at 4 and 5 stories. Get rid of the car or lessen the car, you can do wonderful things in 4 and 5 stories and have that dialogue, and train our planners to have that honest dialogue and persevere through a discussion so we don't throw the developer out there early.
Mark.
Well, I don't think there's a silver bullet. There's probably a good package of policies we can talk about. But
I'm hoping we'll make the package here. So put yours in there.
One would be, I say that we have a rare opportunity where the city of LA is updating its general plan, many community plans, and its zoning code all at the same time, almost accidentally. And so we need some leadership from, whether it's the mayor and the city council or civic leaders like yourselves, to be like, get it right. We're in a crisis. We have an opportunity. Don't just leave it up to each plan to kind of go out and ask the few normal angry participants what they want. Like, have citywide goals for what can make this a great city, and make sure they get put in there. Contextually, obviously, but make sure you have a citywide goals.
And flexible. Make it flexible so it can change.
And I'm so glad you said plans, so I didn't have to use my opportunity for planning, which I would have. But I would throw out that we are the great urban laboratory of the world. We have a very diverse region, and this is a place where we could do pilot projects and try things out in solving problems specifically for communities and do something different and try them out. Things like, and I'll just throw out there, the best pilot project we ever did in LA was the adaptive reuse ordinance, where it was adopted for one neighborhood. It was a pilot project, but it worked well and it spread to other neighborhoods, to the whole downtown, to other communities, and then became citywide. So I would throw out, we need to be trying out things here and solving specific problems in communities.
In the light of the planning, there's a lot of controversy going on over, I think they call it the bicycle diet or the bicycle lanes, and how that ties in. And I get the, I get the concept, but there's certainly a lot of people that feel that they're being damaged in the process. Can you speak to those, lessening traffic lanes and giving them to bicycles when I don't have a shower to shower after I've ridden 20 miles to my place of business?
Yeah, I mean, well, they call them road diets, where sometimes when you want to put in bike infrastructure, you have space in the street, you can do it. But sometimes you need to remove a vehicle lane or two to allow the street to be, what they call a complete street, where there's, you can walk safely, you can ride a bike if you want, you can drive, you can take the bus or whatever. And as with any kind of change, it gets, people feel like something's being taken away from them. But for public health, for sustainability, for kind of safety, protecting the lives of our fellow Angelenos, I do feel like it's the right thing to do. It's part of the city's mobility element that was adopted as part of the general plan. Maybe there's communication that needs to happen that's better. But I also feel like, we're changing the transportation, the mobility system of the region really rapidly, potentially, with transit, with bikes, with walking, with shared vehicles and autonomous vehicles. So people just need to give it some time, because it's like we had the old car-dominated way, or to get to a more multimodal way, and it's always, the pain is always in the transition. But if we slow it down, that pain's going to be 50 years versus 10 years. So let's let some stuff happen and see how it goes.
Thank you all for showing up today, by the way. My name is Ren. I'm 34 years old. I work in real estate. I have for about 10 years since I got out of UCLA. And I think there's a lot of people like me that would like to give back to our city in great ways, and I know you all challenged us to do that. But I wanted to see, I think the barrier of entry at my point in my life, with a family with kids, running a business, employing people under me, how does one like me, or if you're speaking to the audience, how do we give back, and how do we actually create policies to do this?
Well, let me, one of the things we didn't talk about is the commissions that provide guidance to all of us. And it takes good people to volunteer for those. And if you look at some cities, it's the same 10, 20, probably the same 50 people who are on all the commissions and have been for decades. It's time to get younger folks involved. Step up, talk to your local councilman, talk to the mayor, talk to those decision makers. It's really important that good people get involved, enlightened people get involved on those commissions. I think the average age of commissions in the city and the county must be 75 or something. I mean, it's remarkable when you go into those commissions and see folks. And I think we have to grow a new generation of people who are forward thinking and will understand some new concepts and not be wedded to the old way and to status quo. So please, one plea is please volunteer, talk to your city council member, talk to the local politicians. I know in LA that's harder. In some of the smaller cities it's much easier and you have much better access. But there are dozens of commissions in small and large cities that are, and folks are really at the political level looking for new blood. So please get involved in that. And obviously go to the public hearings, because as was pointed out earlier, you get and we've all seen it, the same half a dozen people who are steadfast in their view, and you're never going to move them, and they dominate those meetings, and there's no balance, and what we really need in the dialogue is balance. So please get involved. I know it's hard with young people, with children and whatnot, but it's so important to our future.
Join your neighborhood council.
Yeah.
They could use some sanity and some, and they could use some smart people. Yeah. And so it's, engage in your own community. I would also suggest, if you don't even have time to do that, with your own employees, take a little time occasionally, have a brown bag lunch, and think bigger. Think about what's going on in the whole city. Talk about it. It's raising awareness.
I want to finish up by just thanking the Lusk staff for making this event go off as well as it did. One of the nice things about my job is I know when we do events like this, I really don't have to worry about them because I have such good people putting them together. And so, again, I just want to give a shout out to Marilyn Ellis, who's sitting in the back there. I think my vision isn't that good. Is she? Yeah, okay. Suzanne Fitzmaurice, Ravat Benitez, Jenny Frappier out front, Mary Peralta, who was here earlier today. Is that everybody from the staff who's been here today? I always miss somebody. Okay. So if we could just have a round of applause for the people who organized this. And otherwise, thank you all so much for coming. I hope you found it a worthwhile morning. I know I learned a lot this morning, and so I want to thank one more time all of our panelists, our keynoter, Ginger Charles, our moderators for the outstanding job they did today, and have a great afternoon.